Hello again, Steve here. And as you may know, if you've watched some of my other videos, I happen to like words. Probably you do too. So I want to discuss with what I think is an important word to not necessarily to use much of, but to understand the nature of what's being implied by the word, or what's being described by the word. The word is polemics, and I use it once in a while, but not very often. But basically, I want to talk about it because it relates to a lot of the discourse that's been going on in the minds and words of probably millions of people over the last month here, actually many months probably, to do with a giant election somewhere in the world, need I say where. And the nature of what this is a form of communication, right? And it has to do with dispute and controversy mostly, right? So it is a type of communication which is intended to stir up dispute and controversy, right? And dispute, if we look at that, the main part of the word, the pute word, means in the origin of it like pave, to make nice and smooth. And we can see that in the word picture of driving down the road, a nicely paved road. We don't have to be worried too much about what's going to happen to our suspension, right? It's pretty predictable, right? But if what happens, like sometimes on the prairies where I live, where rural areas run out of money and they have to take the pavement out and it turns into a potholed road, then you're never sure, right? So you probably don't want to go there. And so somebody who has this type of nature in their conversation, you probably don't want them at a dinner party, right? They don't want to. You don't want somebody bringing controversy. Controversy. This contro means like the opposite of, and verse in its origin means a line, right? We see a line in a line or a section in a song or a poem is a verse, and the contra of that is it's all over the place. It's unpredictable, and it's an attack, right? Often, because it also polemics also means the warlike nature of words, right? Um, Acting like an enemy, acting with hostility in the words. Now, there's an old saying by, I believe it was Socrates, who once said that when the argument is lost, slander becomes the tool of the loser. And this makes sense in a way, because if you're fighting for your cause but your argument isn't working anymore, then you have to turn to slander. And slander is an attack. It's a personal attack or an attack on an organization or something like that, which is a diversion from the argument without talking about the issues at stake. They are disputatious and controversial. You'll see things like trumped up charges, such as um, sexual impropriety allegations, which are unsubstantiated. Things like accusations of foreigners meddling and your opponent being part of some sort of foreign organization or something like that. Anyways, all kinds of fabrications being churned up. And this is the nature of polemics. This is the nature of a war of words, right? But I think it also goes deeper than that, because no side of any political campaign is exempt from this. Though it tends to show up more on the left, I think, because so many of the left's arguments have been disputed beyond argument anymore. So when you no longer have strong arguments, you have to resort to some sort of slander, an attack, conquer and divide, which, as it turns out, I'm finding out lately that the left in general, and an example of the Democrat Party in the U.S., has been involved in a very slanderous, seditious, racist, race baiting, sex baiting tactic since its inception, really. So it's not surprising, but it's not the only one, because it's not any two sides. It will fly out from both sides, but tends to be used heavier on the side that doesn't have as strong of arguments. Now, I think in politics, especially politics, which is the form of governance and the form of the form of governance that the world over runs on, is a warlike situation. It is an adversarial nature for ruling, right? It's an authoritarian top-down, even though it's supposed to be by the people, but it turns out to be a top-down authoritarian organization modeled on the traditional family, basically. And so there's actually a really good book that's written. It's called The Origins of War and Child Abuse. So we can understand the reason why we get into these situations, these warlike situations, using polemics, and then using it to insert it through politics to get hold of the laws and the guns of the state, is probably because we were trained that way. I mean, how else do we learn a language, right? A language or a way of living. But I think it's important. I think it's an important word because it's important to recognize the nature of human beings, to recognize that important things that thing that Socrates once said, which is that once the argument is lost, right, and somebody still doesn't want to give up and concede defeat, or concede that, hey, I'm sorry, I might have been wrong, there's the resort to the attack, right? The verbal attack to cause dispute, controversy, and to act like an enemy in hostility. Because even if what somebody is saying is correct, if they are perceived as a bad person, right? I mean, if you have somebody living in your neighborhood who, in spite of all their goodwill and in spite of all their benevolence and their actions and so on, if in the minds of everybody it is instilled that that is a very bad person who has ill intent and so on, if there's a use of polemics somehow on that individual and it gets into the minds of everybody, then it can have a very disastrous effect and nefarious effect on that individual. So we see this so much in politics. I don't think it's a good example of how we should live at all. In fact, it's like the opposite. And I think the reason why it is there so strongly in politics is because the people of that nature gravitate to that, right? There's all sorts of people in the world. There are those who just want to get along. There's those who want to go to work and create a better world and so on. But there are always the criminally minded who want to rob, steal, and deceive people for their own benefit, not having to create anything. So when they work their way up, they're not really producing anything. So in order for them to gain advantage over others without producing something, they have to push the others down, right? Like, there's ways to get ahead in the world. You can become super great at something and rise while helping a lot of people along the way. The other way you can do it is if you just push others out of the way through slander and warlike controversy, disputes, and so on about others, and you somehow masterfully manipulate the media outlets and so on to do that as well, then you can rise because others are falling, not because you're rising, right? And the amazing part about it with this election is, from my perspective, there was hugely more polemics on the Democrat side than the Republican side. And I shouldn't even say the Republican side, because the Trump side was basically not Republican. It was independent with a Republican stamp, but most Republicans ran into the bush, and then as soon as he was elected, now they're running back, right, and trying to get on the boarding party. But I don't think the polemics worked at this time. It didn't work very well because there was a counter-narrative, right? And a lot of polemics on the counter-narrative, don't get me wrong, a lot of that, and I got caught up in some of that as well. There's that nature in human beings, right, to be tribal, right? It's still there. We might think we're all this evolved creature, but really down in the base of us is this tribal animal who wants to win over the other, and sometimes at any cost. And this is why we see all methods of war coming out when it is so important. Like this election, many people on both sides saw this as a huge crossroads for the civilization of humanity. Not only for the US, but many people were rooting for either sides around the world, because what happens in the US generally affects the rest of the world, right? So it was so big that people did not hold back. And we saw polemics come out in spades, for sure. people acting warlike. Because, the acting warlike in politics is perfectly understandable because it is an adversarial system and it results in war. If you look at the U.S., for example, I forget, I should have checked before I started this, but I think it's about 37 of the last 37 years, the U.S. has been at war somewhere. Actual, war with guns and everything. And within, there's millions and millions of police who are basically, paramilitaries, and they also act warlike at times. And when you have politics, which once somebody's elected is no longer voluntary, and for those who don't vote, none of it's voluntary. So, for example, you have a group of people who pay taxes, who are forced to pay taxes, so that they can be given to other people and other institutions and banksters and foreign governments and foreign terrorists and foreign arms sales and so on. And they didn't get these people's permission as to what it was going to be spent on. It has to be taken under the force of threat, right? Under the force of threat. Your house is going to be taken away. Your wages are going to be garnished. You're going to be fined. You're going to be imprisoned, and all these sorts of things if you don't give this. That's different than in a Toastmasters club, for example. And I use that over and over again, the Toastmasters club scenario, because it is a voluntary organization. And when we vote for our executive in the spring, there's not a whole lot of controversy, because if you disagree with it, you can leave or whatever, and you can have a debate. You don't have to fight over it, because it's not as life and death as this can be. Because all these people up here, these politicians, they create these so-called laws, which they back up with guns. At the end of the day, if you follow every one of these laws is a death threat, right? Because if you don't obey, and papers are sent out, and guys in black robes stamp, and they drop gavels and so on, and then there's summons is set out to show up, and you don't show up. And if you resist those who show up, who are carrying guns, they will shoot you, right? So at the end, they're all death threats. So it is very, very tempting. It is a war. It is a sort of war going on. It's a war of slavery that's always going on. And what is it that really creates this? What is it that allows? What is the overriding situation? What is it that happens first? It's words, right? So naturally, polemics is going to be used. And it's important for us to recognize. We have to become people who are logical and able to work through the words and understand what an argument is and what is not an argument, what is substantive and what is not substantive. And if we see that all of a sudden in the late stages of an election, some woman comes forward after 30 years of never complaining about anything, and she happens to be like a stripper or something like that. What was it? This lady came forth as accusation against Donald Trump, and she was a porn star, and apparently she was coming out the next day with, I don't know what it was. Dildos or Us or something like that, and she claims that Donald Trump kissed her, like 30 years ago or something. Are you kidding me? That many years later. So you can see the polemics. That's a direct attack. It's causing dispute, controversy. It's warlike. It's creating an enemy and hostility, right there with no substance. And it's all over the media, and it's just somebody's words. So I think it's an important thing to understand polemics, because it is throughout the discourse of the media. Most of the media is government. It's mostly BS, and it's mostly designed to keep the war going and keep those who are paying, right? This election has been a big overthrow of polemics, but it's not going to end, because it hasn't ended since Socrates, so I think it's got some life in it yet. But be aware of it. Steve here again, great chatting. Talk again soon. Bye for now.